Hey guys, tonight we are going to step back into a world where winter was not just cold. It was a season that tested whether you and your family would make it to spring at all. Picture this. You wake up in a cramped, smoky hut before the sun even peeks over the frost-covered fields. Your breath clouds in the air. The thatch roof above your head is crusted with frost because the fire died in the night. You pull the rough wool blanket tighter, but it doesn't stop the chill from biting at your fingers and toes. And here's the kicker. If you think you'd last even 1 week in this place, you probably won't survive this story. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you're listening. I love seeing how far these bedtime journeys travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is somewhere in the Middle Ages, though time feels fuzzy when you're shivering before dawn. You push aside the scratchy blanket and sit up, the cold earth floor numbing your bare feet instantly. Your hut is dark, save for the faint glow of embers in the hearth. You shuffle over, crouching low, and coax the fire back to life with bits of dried twig and straw. Fuel is precious, every scrap gathered weeks ago when the weather was kinder. Without fire, the hut is little more than a frozen box. Your family stirs behind you, your partner, perhaps a couple of children, all bundled together for warmth. Privacy doesn't exist. Comfort doesn't either. Smoke from the hearth fills the space, escaping only through a hole in the thatch. Your eyes water, your lungs sting, but you're grateful. Smoke keeps pests away and adds a faint layer of insulation. Historians still argue whether these smoky interiors were more curse than blessing. But for you, it's simple. No smoke means no fire, and no fire means no survival. Your stomach already gnaws with hunger. The grain chest is lighter than it was at harvest. Bread baked weeks ago has hardened to the texture of stone, but it can be softened in broth. You glance at the corner where a clay pot sits. Yesterday's pottage congealed and waiting to be reheated. The stew isn't glamorous. It's little more than barley, cabbage, and maybe a shred of salted pork rind if you were lucky. Yet this is breakfast, lunch, and dinner all in one. You step outside for a moment, breath billowing like smoke into the icy air. The village is silent under its blanket of frost. Chickens huddle in the coop, refusing to scratch for food until the sun rises. The pig snorts softly in its pen, a living bank account for the day when hunger grows unbearable. You notice tracks in the snow, fox or dog, hard to tell. Predators circle villages like creditors, always ready to take what little remains. A quirky detail you might not expect. Some peasants actually lined their boots, or what passed for boots, with straw, stuffing it tight for insulation. It wasn't comfortable, but it was better than frostbite. You feel the crunch of straw inside your shoes now as you trudge back indoors, praying it holds out until spring. You settle by the fire, stirring the pot as the stew thins into something edible. It smells earthy, heavy with cabbage, not exactly appetizing, but it's fuel. A neighbor knocks and steps in, shaking off the cold. He brings news of another family nearby who lost their food stores to rats. You shiver. Not from the cold this time, but from the reminder of how fragile survival is. One broken jar, one hole in the thatch, and a whole winter's security can vanish overnight. Breakfast is served. Each person gets a ladle of pottage, a slice of hardened bread softened in the broth. No one complains. Complaining wastes energy, and energy is too precious. Children chew slowly, as if trying to make the moment last. You feel the warmth spread from your stomach, thin though it is, and already you think about what's left for tonight. The day will be spent scavenging firewood, tending animals, repairing tools, and praying the stores hold out. There's no luxury of idleness. If your hands aren't working, your family is losing. Still, beneath the harshness, there's a rhythm. The fire crackling, the murmur of children, the whistle of wind through the thatch. Life here is survival distilled to its rawest form. And so, as the dawn rises over a frozen landscape, you begin another day in a medieval winter. Hungry, cold, but alive. And for now, that's enough. The fire in your hut has warmed enough to chase away the damp chill, but hunger lingers heavier than frost. You glance again at the bread lying on the table, if it can be called bread at all. A lump of dark, dense rye that's closer to a brick than the fluffy loaves you dream about. You break off a piece with effort, nearly cracking a tooth, and dunk it in the steaming broth just to soften it enough to chew. This is bread in the Middle Ages for peasants. Not the white wheat loaves you see in paintings of noble banquets, but rough, coarse hunks of rye, barley, or oats, often mixed with whatever filler could be scraped together. Acorns ground into flour, chestnuts crushed to bulk it out, even powdered legumes added to stretch the supply. Historians still argue whether these additions were creative or desperate, but for you, it doesn't matter. It fills the stomach, even if just barely. You bite down and taste bitterness. Rye bread, especially when stored poorly, can mold or even develop ergot, a fungus with nasty side effects. Hallucinations, convulsions, sometimes death. Villagers whispered of curses and witchcraft when people stumbled through the streets after eating tainted bread. You've seen it yourself. Neighbors trembling, eyes rolling as if possessed. But hunger has no patience for fear. You chew carefully, trusting your luck. The texture is rough, grains only half ground because querns, the grinding stones, never made fine flour for common folk. Your teeth catch on tiny grit, and you remember how often peasants lost molars young. A quirky tidbit. Archaeologists examining medieval skeletons often find tooth enamel worn down to stubs, ground away by flour laced with stone dust from primitive mills. Tonight, as you swallow, you feel that scrape already working its way into your mouth. Bread is rationed. Each family guards their loaves like treasure, cutting portions thin. Sometimes it's baked once a week, enough for days, though by day 4 it's so hard you could hammer nails with it. You wrap the rest in a cloth, set it high on the shelf, away from mice. Rats are cleverer than lox, though, so you hang your bag of grain from the rafters, swinging gently like a cradle. There's a saying in your village: better black bread today than white bread never. It's meant to remind you that only the wealthy eat wheat bread regularly. You imagine the monastery kitchens, where monks bake loaves of pale, fragrant wheat flour. You'll never taste them, but the smell drifts sometimes from their ovens, maddening in its sweetness. You take another bite. The crust cracks, sharp enough to cut your gums. Children grimace, tugging at their portions, but no one dares complain. Bread isn't just food. It's survival. It's currency. Rent to your lord might be demanded in grain. Taxes are measured in loaves. Bread holds power. You remember the tales of cities where riots broke out when bakers adulterated flour, adding chalk or sawdust. In your small hamlet, there's no riot, just resignation. Your neighbor visits again, carrying his own loaf to compare. His wife baked with peas this time. and the bread smells faintly earthy. He jokes that peasants invent new recipes only when starving forces their hand. You laugh, though it comes out thin. Humor is another kind of survival. There's also ritual to bread. Before you cut into it, you make the sign of the cross on the crust. It's habit, but also hope that the loaf will last, that no child will go hungry tonight. Bread is body. Bread is blessing. Even when it tastes like bitterness, it carries meaning. As you chew, your mind drifts to stories of years when harvests failed. You've heard of winters where bark and straw were ground into flour, making loaves so foul that even pigs turned their snouts away. You picture gnawing on bark like some half-starved deer, and you shudder. Hunger has no bottom, only layers you peel back until dignity is gone. For now, though, there's bread, and though it is black, bitter, and gritty, it is enough to keep your legs moving, your hands working, your children breathing. You close your eyes as you chew, telling yourself it tastes almost like the warm wheat loaves you've never known. Almost. The bread in your belly dulls the edge of hunger, but you know it won't last. Bread alone can't carry you through the endless hours of biting wind and heavy work. That's where the pot on the hearth comes in, the simmering heart of every peasant hut. You lift the lid, steam curling into your face, and there it is, pottage. Thick, soupy, always changing yet somehow always the same. Porridge in the morning, pottage by night, and a stew that never truly leaves the fire. This pot is like an old friend, bubbling with grains, roots, and whatever scraps of meat or fat could be spared. Sometimes it's a celebration of variety. Onions, beans, cabbage, maybe even a carrot if the cellar still has a few left. Other times it's grim and gray, flavored with nothing more than salted water and the faint memory of yesterday's cabbage leaf. You take up the wooden ladle, stir the contents, and listen to the gentle plop of barley against the pot's edge. The smell is earthy, slightly sour, but comforting in its familiarity. It's not a meal, it's the meal. Without pottage, you wouldn't make it to February. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants found variety in their diet or whether monotony ruled every table. The truth probably lies in between. In good years, with a decent harvest, pottage could be hearty, even pleasant. Add a bone or two for flavor, maybe herbs dried in summer, and you'd have something filling, if not exactly exciting. In lean times, though, the pot grew sadder each day, until it was little more than warm water with a floating onion skin. You dip a spoon and taste. Today's brew is thickened with oats, heavy and chewy. You chew slowly, pretending the texture is meatier than it is. A quirky detail you might not expect. Some peasants intentionally left the pot cooking for days without scrubbing it clean, letting layers of old flavor build up until the stew became a strange palimpsest of meals past. Imagine a medieval slow cooker, but one where last week's turnip is still whispering to tonight's barley. The children gather, bowls in hand. You pour carefully, making sure each one gets a fair share. Arguments break out easily when stomachs are empty. A child protests, there's no meat again. You hush them, reminding them of the pig in the pen. It won't be slaughtered until Lent ends, or unless desperation forces your hand. Until then, the pig grows fat while you grow lean. The pot is also a mirror of the seasons. In autumn, it's rich with beans and fresh vegetables. In early winter, it leans on cabbages, onions, and stored roots. By February, it thins to watery gruel, each ladle more memory than meal. And yet the ritual remains. Stir, ladle, eat, repeat. You glance toward the herbs hanging from the rafters. Sage, thyme, maybe even a little rosemary, precious sprigs dried in the summer sun. Adding them to the pot is a gamble. Use them now, and the stew tastes alive for one night. Save them, and you carry their promise into March. You crumble a pinch between your fingers, letting the fragrance lift spirits around the table. For a moment, it almost feels like a feast. Still, your mind drifts to tales of better stews, the ones in castles, filled with venison, rabbits, whole chickens swimming in rich broth. Nobles tasted meat daily. You tasted a handful of times in a season. You imagine sinking your teeth into tender venison and laugh bitterly. Tonight, it's oats, onions, and cabbage, and that's fine. You don't need luxury, only survival. And yet, survival has its poetry. The bubbling of the pot, the warm bowls passed hand to hand, the children slurping noisily. It creates a rhythm, a strange comfort against the howling wind outside. Even in hunger, there's togetherness. Even in monotony, there's life. You lean back, bowl empty, and let the warmth seep into your chest. Tomorrow, the pot will bubble again, and the day after, and the day after that. Each spoonful is another step toward spring. The stew lingers in your belly, warm but fleeting. You know what really carries people through the winter isn't cabbage or oats. It's the meat that's been salted, smoked, or dried months ago. You turn to the corner of the hut, where slabs of pork hang from the rafters, darkened with smoke, tough as leather. They swing slightly in the draft like grim ornaments, reminders of the autumn slaughter when every family gathered to butcher pigs before the frost set in. Meat is not a daily food for peasants. It's an occasion, a rare indulgence. But it is also survival insurance. When the ground is too hard to dig, when the cellars are emptying, when the pot of pottage looks thinner than your hope, a sliver of smoked bacon can turn despair into endurance. You cut one now, a strip so small it would insult a nobleman's dog. Into the pot it goes, hissing as fat rises and perfumes the air. The children's eyes widen. The stew suddenly tastes alive. Salt is the true treasure here. Without salt, meat rots before winter even begins. You've heard tales of towns built on salt trade, fortunes made from the white crystals. For you, salt is measured out carefully, pinched like gold dust. You recall when your family cured a ham, rubbing it with coarse salt until it burned your fingertips, then hanging it in the rafters for weeks. The taste later was sharp, almost metallic, but it meant safety. Historians still argue whether salt was affordable for common folk or a rare commodity reserved for lords. But in your hut, a pinch is priceless. You bite into a piece of smoked pork. It's tough, chewy, almost impossible to tear, but the flavor explodes, smoky, salty, rich with memories of summer. You suck on the fat long after the meat is gone, unwilling to waste a drop. The children beg for more, but you shake your head. This strip has to stretch through 3 meals, maybe 4. Fish is another lifeline. If you live near a river or coast, fish is salted and dried in summer, stacked in baskets until the smell seeps into every wall. Herring, eels, even small river fish, nothing goes to waste. Monasteries thrive on fish, especially during fasting days when meat is forbidden. You've seen neighbors eat eels with grimaces, swearing the slimy things kept them alive when pork could not. A quirky tidbit you may not expect. Peasants sometimes smoked meat in the very same room they slept in. The rafters above the hearth doubled as a smokehouse, filling the hut with haze. So, in a way, your blankets, your clothes, even your skin carry the faint tang of bacon. Imagine going to bed each night smelling like tomorrow's dinner. It sounds nice until you realize it also attracts rats. You remember stories of desperate winters when people gnawed on bones long since stripped of flesh, boiling them again and again until the broth turned cloudy. In the worst years, even dogs and cats were not safe. You shudder, pushing the thought away. For now, you still have meat in the rafters. For now, your family is safe. The fire crackles, the smell of pork fills the hut, and for a moment you could almost believe you live like the wealthy, like the lords who feast on venison and pheasant every night. You close your eyes and savor the illusion. The taste of salt, smoke, and fat lingers on your tongue, anchoring you through another freezing day. The smoky taste of pork still lingers, but you know it can't carry the household through months of ice. The real backbone of winter survival lies below the earth, in the root cellars dug deep into cool soil, where vegetables slumber in the dark like hidden treasure. You grab a torch and lift the heavy wooden hatch, the air rushing up damp and earthy, tinged with the faint sweetness of stored turnips. You descend carefully, the ground crunching with frost above your head. But here the temperature holds steady, protective. Clay jars and woven baskets line the shelves. Turnips, beets, parsnips, and carrots lie in heaps, some wrinkled but still edible, packed in straw or sand to keep them from rotting. Onions dangle from braids, garlic cloves hang in clusters, and in the corner sits a barrel of cabbages, pickled and sour but dependable. It isn't pretty, but it's life. Historians still argue whether peasants ate more turnips or cabbages in the Middle Ages, but both hold equal weight in your cellar. The humble turnip feeds you when grain runs out, while cabbage, salted and fermented, offers both food and medicine. People whisper that sauerkraut fights scurvy, though no one knows the word. They just say it keeps gums from bleeding in late winter. You lift a carrot, pale and crooked, nothing like the bright orange ones from modern gardens. Medieval carrots come in shades of purple, yellow, even white, their sweetness faint but welcome. You bite down. The flesh crunches, earthy and tough, but refreshing compared to yesterday's chewy bread. Children squeal with delight when roots are brought up. They're as close to candy as winter allows. A quirky detail. Onions were so valued that peasants sometimes paid rent with them. You think about that as you slice one thin, tears stinging your eyes, the sharp smell filling the hut. Tossed into the pottage, it transforms the broth into something deeper, more alive. Even a single onion can shift the mood of the meal. But nothing in the cellar is endless. Each week, the baskets grow lighter, the straw more empty. You count and recount the turnips, doing mental math. Will this last until spring planting? You ration carefully, pulling the smallest roots first, leaving the sturdiest ones for later. You've heard tales of villages where cellars froze solid and every vegetable turned to mush overnight. You say a quiet prayer against such misfortune. The children beg for apples. You saved a few in the autumn, storing them carefully in straw. You bring one up, soft and wrinkled, but when you cut it, the flesh still shines faintly with sweetness. They fight over slices, the juice sticky on their lips, and for a moment you remember the crisp snap of fresh harvest days. That memory alone feels warmer than the fire. You also keep dried beans in sacks, rattling like stones when poured out. These are winter's quiet soldiers, long-lasting, filling, and reliable. They swell in the pot, soaking up flavor from pork fat and onions. Some call beans poor man's meat, and it's true. Their richness keeps your muscles working when hunting is impossible. Of course, pests are always waiting. You check the sacks for holes, praying no rats have tunneled in. A single rat can ruin weeks of food, and their droppings bring sickness. That's why cats are as valuable as plows, guardians of the cellar's treasure. You stroke your scruffy cat's fur, grateful for her sharp teeth and sharper ears. As you climb back up with arms full of roots, you breathe in the fresh sting of cold air. Above ground, the fields are barren, blanketed in snow. But beneath your hut lies this secret hoard of earthy flavors. Without it, winter would be a sentence of starvation. With it, you have hope. A slow, steady drip of calories that keeps the family alive until the first shoots of spring break the frost. The roots from the cellar keep you alive, but they can't do everything. When bellies ache and muscles weaken, you reach for another quiet miracle: dairy. It doesn't sound glamorous, no cream-topped lattes here, but milk, butter, and cheese are among the most dependable lifelines a peasant family can hold on to during the bleakest stretch of winter. You step outside, boots crunching in the frost, and make your way toward the animal pen. The cow exhales steam into the icy air, her hide crusted with frost. She looks at you with weary eyes, ribs faint beneath her winter coat. Even she feels the pinch of the season. Pastures lie buried under snow, and hay is running low. Still, she offers something no field can: milk. You crouch on the low stool, pail beneath, hands stiff but practiced. The warm stream hits the tin, froth rising even in the cold. The rhythm is soothing: squeeze, release, squeeze, release. Milk is more than food. It's comfort. It's warmth. You remember your mother saying, "A cow is a peasant's candle in the dark." And tonight, you understand why. Fresh milk doesn't last long, though. By the hearth, you heat some into a thin gruel for the children, mixing it with oats until it thickens into porridge. Their faces light up at the taste, sweeter and richer than plain water. It buys you a moment of peace. But most milk doesn't stay milk for long. Butter is the gold you churn from it, a lump of dense energy that can last weeks if kept cool. You recall summer days spent turning the churn, arms aching as cream slowly thickened into butter. Now, in the dead of winter, a pat of that butter melts into the pot, transforming pottage from gray sludge into something almost celebratory. Historians still argue whether butter was common for peasants or mostly a regional staple. But for you, even a smear on stale bread feels like feasting. Cheese is the true survivor. Wheels of hard, tangy rounds sit aging in cool corners, wrapped in cloth and wax, waiting to be sliced when desperation peaks. Cheese doesn't spoil easily. It sharpens, it deepens, it keeps. You cut a wedge tonight, the knife scraping through its crumbly flesh. It smells pungent, strong enough to wrinkle noses, but each bite is dense with calories, the taste lingering long after the last swallow. A quirky detail. Some villages swore that eating certain cheeses in winter warded off illness, while others believed too much cheese clogged the brain and dulled the spirit. Superstition or science, you don't care. You just need to fill your stomach. Even goats, scrappy creatures with mischievous eyes, pull their weight. Their milk is thinner, sharper in flavor, but goats can survive on scrub and weeds where cows would starve. You watch a neighbor lead his goat through the snow, praising it as the poor man's cow. You envy him slightly. Goats eat nearly anything, which makes them stubborn but reliable. Of course, not every family can spare animals for milk. Winter fodder is expensive, and sometimes the only choice is to slaughter the cow for meat rather than starve, keeping it alive. You've seen the sorrow in a man's eyes when he slits the throat of the beast that once fed his children. The meat will last weeks, yes, but the milk is gone forever. Survival forces hard choices. Back inside, the children lick their bowls clean. milk porridge smeared across their cheeks. You smile faintly, though your mind calculates how many more days until the hay runs out, how many more mornings the cow can be coaxed to give. For now, though, you have dairy, white, rich, and forgiving. In a world where every calorie matters, it is a small miracle poured fresh into your pail, churned into your butter, pressed into your cheese. And with each bite, winter feels just a little less cruel. You lift a wooden cup to your lips, but what meets you is not clear water. It is ale, cloudy, brownish, faintly sour, and weak. In medieval villages, this was the everyday drink, the one thing poured at breakfast, dinner, and supper alike. Not because it was festive, nor because peasants sought cheer at every hour, but because water itself was feared. Wells could be foul, rivers teeming with waste, and stagnant pools a breeding ground for sickness. To drink water straight was to risk disease. To drink ale, however thin, was safer. This ale was not the potent, heady brew you might imagine from tavern tales. It was small beer, weak in alcohol but strong in usefulness. Grain was boiled in the brewing, and in that boiling, the lurking sickness of water was burned away. A handful of malted barley, oats, or rye gave it body. Herbs like yarrow or bog myrtle flavored it where hops were unknown. It was just enough to nourish, to hydrate, and to fill the belly without dulling the mind. Even children sipped it, their cups no different from their parents. Picture the hearth on a winter's morning. A mother draws ale from a clay jug, pours it into rough wooden bowls, and passes it to her children before they trudge into the frost to tend sheep or carry water. The drink is mild, but it carries warmth, a faint sweetness from the grain. Later, when her husband returns from the fields, sweating even in the cold, he too slakes his thirst with ale, not water. The jug is passed around, emptied, refilled, brewed again. Brewing was not a luxury, but a household craft. Women, more often than not, were the brewers, alewives, as they were called. In nearly every village, some women brewed not only for their families, but for neighbors, selling jugs of small beer at the market. Brewing was both survival and livelihood, a rhythm of soaking, boiling, fermenting, straining, and storing that tied the household to its food supply as tightly as bread baking did. Imagine the sound of it, the bubbling of fermenting wort in wooden tubs, the creak of ladles stirring, the earthy scent of grain steeping by the fire. It was not glamorous, but it was as essential as spinning wool or baking bread. Without ale, thirst pressed on the people. With it, even the harshest winter seemed more endurable. For peasants, ale also carried a sense of community. To share a drink was to share trust. At the long boards of feast days or the crowded benches of a neighbor's hearth, cups of ale bound people together, easing hunger, easing grief, giving warmth where there was little else. It was a drink of fellowship as much as survival. And so, while nobles might sip wine imported from France or Italy, the common folk lived by ale. Weak though it was, it gave strength. Thin though it seemed, it sustained. Each sip carried not only liquid but reassurance. This will not sicken you, this will not betray you. In a world where even water could kill, ale was the peasant's daily companion, humble, constant, life-giving. When the winter stores began to thin and the cupboard shelves grew echoingly empty, peasants turned outward into the frozen fields, the skeletal forests, and the wind-beaten hedgerows, seeking whatever nature still clutched to her breast. You, too, would have stepped outside, cloak pulled tight against the sting of January air, eyes searching not for beauty, but for survival. Foraging in winter was not a pastime. It was an act of desperation, a quiet dialogue with the land that might mean the difference between life and starvation. Even in the leanest season, some gifts could be coaxed from the earth. Nuts gathered in the autumn were carefully stored, hazelnuts, chestnuts, and walnuts tucked away in sacks or earthen jars. These were cracked open one by one, chewed slowly as if each bite might stretch longer in the belly. Dried berries, shriveled black on their stems, could sometimes be found clinging stubbornly in thickets. Sloes, hawthorn haws, or rose hips, tart but precious. They were boiled into thin teas or mashed into pastes, their vitamin-rich flesh unknowingly warding off illness. Herbs and roots offered other lifelines. Wild garlic, if the snows melted just enough, could be plucked in hidden patches and crushed into pottage for flavor and strength. Dandelion roots, dug from the frozen ground, were roasted as a bitter but warming drink. Even tree bark, stripped from birch or pine, could be ground into rough flour, a last resort that spoke of hunger so deep it silenced pride. Children were often sent out as foragers, their small hands quick at spotting what adults overlooked. You can imagine them scurrying across frosted fields, eyes sharp for anything edible. A handful of sorrel leaves peeking through, mushrooms clinging damp to fallen logs, or clumps of nettle, painful to touch, but nourishing when boiled. In times of scarcity, even the bitterest weeds were welcomed like delicacies. The knowledge of where to look, what to pick, and how to prepare it was passed down like treasure. Grandmothers knew the secret corners where wild parsley might still be green, or the hollow trees where honeybees had left wax and sweetness. This lore was as important as seed grain, for in the depth of winter, books could not feed you. Only the land could. And so the peasant's relationship with the wilderness was intimate, born not of choice but necessity. Each hedge, each grove, each stream bank was remembered as a map of survival. In the silence of a snow-covered morning, you might have wandered too, basket in hand, hoping that nature would not turn her back on you. Foraging was not abundance. It was scraping, scratching, gathering crumbs of life from the margins. Yet those crumbs, when stirred into a pot, might feed a family for one more night. Hunger made you grateful for things you would otherwise have ignored. It taught you to see food where others saw only weeds, to cherish the earth's smallest mercies. And in those small mercies, there was a lesson, that even in winter's cruelty, the land whispered, "Survive." You wake to the same gray cold of winter, but today there's a different energy in the air. The bells in the small wooden church tower ring louder, longer, their sound carrying over the frozen fields. It is a feast day, one of the holy markers that punctuate the long, hungry calendar of a medieval peasant. For once, the monotony of thin pottage and crusts of hard bread will give way to something brighter, something heavier on the stomach, something almost miraculous. The church calendar ruled your seasons, saints' days, Christmas, Easter, midwinter festivals, all of them dictated when fasting must happen and when it could break into feasting. And though peasants spent much of the year eating little more than boiled grains and dried roots, on these sacred occasions the tables grew richer, even if only for a single day. The lord of the manor might slaughter an ox or a fattened pig, and though the choicest cuts went to his table, scraps and offal trickled down to the villagers. That alone was reason to gather, reason to smile through the frost-bitten air. Picture the inside of the hall, rough trestle tables set up in a smoky space, rushes scattered across the floor, candles flickering against damp stone walls. Children, wide-eyed, clutch hunks of bread as big as their fists. The smell of roasting meat, rare, intoxicating, fills the air. A woman stirs a cauldron of stew laced with spices saved for this day. Cinnamon or cloves brought in tiny packets from faraway trade routes, shared sparingly but enough to perfume the broth. On feast days, ale flowed more freely, sometimes replaced by stronger brews, and on rare occasions, wine trickled into the cups of the wealthier villagers. This was not ordinary. This was the kind of drink you remembered weeks later when trudging through another snowstorm with only thin gruel in your belly. Historians still argue whether peasants truly ate better during feast days than during summer harvest festivals. But many agree these midwinter feasts were psychological lifelines as much as physical ones. They broke the bleakness. They reminded you that life could still carry joy, laughter, and a fullness of flavor you almost forgot existed. And yet, even in the merriment, inequality lingered. Nobles dined on venison, pheasant, or elaborate pies. The church often displayed its wealth through loaves of white wheat bread peasants rarely touched. You might get a sliver, or more likely a crust handed down once the clergy were satisfied. Still, that crust was softer than your daily rye, and for a moment you felt almost rich. Stories spread around the hearth during these gatherings, tales of saints who fed the hungry, of miracle loaves that never ran out, of visions that promised better harvests. Children listened with wide eyes, their mouths sticky with honeyed cakes baked for the occasion. For one night, bellies filled, cheeks flushed, and laughter cracked the icy silence of winter. When you returned home after such a feast, your stomach heavy and your body warm, you knew tomorrow would return to thin broth and hard bread. But tonight you had tasted abundance, and that memory carried you, like an ember carried in the palm, across the next long stretch of hunger. You sit by the hearth, stomach growling, but the pot hanging above the flames holds little more than a cloudy broth. Hunger is a constant winter companion, and you have learned the small tricks that peasants pass down like secret wisdom. A ladle of watery pottage is stirred longer than needed, as though the stirring itself thickens it. A stone dropped into the pot gives the children something to watch, a magic ritual that makes them believe the meal will somehow taste fuller. When food runs short, imagination fills the gaps. You chew slowly, drawing out each mouthful. A single crust of bread lasts half an hour when dipped again and again into the same bowl of soup. Mothers tell their children, "Bite small, chew long, you'll feel fuller." It isn't science, but it is survival. Some families even left food on the table longer than necessary, letting the smell of the stew trick them into believing they had eaten more than they had. Historians still argue whether these strategies truly helped sustain energy or only distracted the mind, but evidence suggests peasants knew well how to manage hunger pangs. A trickle of ale between bites made a meal feel heavier, and hot broth, even thin, warmed the belly enough to chase away the worst of the gnawing emptiness. There were ingenious ways to stretch ingredients, too. Flour mixed with ground beans or even acorn meal became bread when pure grain was scarce. Turnip tops, beet leaves, or dried nettles bulked out a stew, fooling the eyes if not the stomach. Families kept bones from slaughtered animals long after the meat was gone, reboiling them for flavor until they turned chalky and useless. And when desperation pressed hardest, the peasant mind turned playful, masking hunger with humor. Children were told stories of dream feasts, enchanted banquets where platters never emptied. In their sleep, they could imagine tasting roasted goose, honey cakes, or buttery rolls. Adults smiled at these tales, though the smile was weary, for they too clung to those imagined flavors. You can almost picture the scene. A father lifting his bowl, swirling what little remains, declaring proudly, "Ah, a fine stew, best we've had all year." His wife smirks, the children giggle, and though the pot is almost empty, laughter fills the cracks hunger leaves. It was not a life of plenty, but of constant invention. To stretch, to disguise, to pretend. These were survival arts as real as farming or weaving. Hunger may gnaw, but wit and resilience gave it no easy victory. The winter deepens, and you find yourself staring at an empty shelf where turnips once sat, the grain sack long since scraped clean. This is when hunger shifts from nuisance to terror. You have felt it before. That weakness in the limbs, the dull ache behind the eyes, the dizziness that makes even standing by the fire feel like climbing a hill. Winter famine was not a rarity in medieval Europe. It was expected, a shadow that loomed every year, though some years darker than others. Historians still argue whether the Great Famine of 1315-1317 was the worst in medieval memory, or whether regional famines cut even deeper into daily lives. What is certain is that peasants were most vulnerable. A lord could dip into stored grain reserves or call on distant trade connections. You, the villager, had only what you had stored. And once that was gone, only desperate measures remained. Imagine trudging out into the snow with nothing but a wicker basket, scouring the edges of the woods for anything edible. Bark from certain trees could be ground into a bitter paste. Nettles, if found, could be boiled into a greenish soup. Moss, acorns, even boiled leather from old shoes sometimes entered the pot when nothing else remained. Chroniclers recorded with dismay that in the worst years, parents gave their children straw mixed with ground leaves just to keep something in their stomachs. You may laugh at modern detox diets, but peasants practiced something harsher, surviving on little more than broth made of weeds and water. The fringe tale of cat and dog meat in famine years surfaces in several village accounts whispered with shame. It was never admitted openly, but everyone knew of someone who had done it, and always there were darker rumors. Whispers of cannibalism in the worst winters when the frost bit deeper than mercy. Scholars debate whether these accounts were exaggerations by monks to highlight divine punishment, but the fear alone was real enough to silence whole rooms. Picture the village at such a time. Smoke rising thinly from chimneys, but fewer footsteps in the lanes. Hunger slows you. Neighbors stop visiting. Songs fade. The energy of survival narrows to the bare minimum. Chop enough wood, draw enough water, and pray that something, anything, can be scraped from the earth. And yet, even in the starkest hunger, peasants found stubborn endurance. They watered down ale until it was little more than flavored liquid, but it warmed the stomach. They roasted hollow reeds for a smoky, bitter chew to distract the mouth. They learned to endure the emptiness, to carry it like a constant companion, waiting for the first thaw of spring to break the spell. Every famine left scars, not just on bodies, but on memory. Villages told stories for generations of the winter of no bread, of the year of the hollow bellies. These were not just tales, but warnings, teaching children to always fill the cellar, to never waste even a crumb. For survival in a medieval winter was never guaranteed. You did not conquer hunger. You merely outlasted it, if fortune and faith carried you through. The cold grips harder, but hunger drives you outward. You clutch a small bundle, maybe a handful of onions, or the last threadbare cloth your household can spare, and step into the village lane. Trade becomes your lifeline. In these months, barter ruled. Coins had little use when no one had food to sell. You might offer firewood for a bowl of peas, or spin wool into yarn in exchange for a slice of cheese. Every hut had something, however meager, and survival depended on finding the right neighbor at the right time. Picture the market square on a frostbitten morning. No lush piles of produce, no shining cuts of meat. Instead, baskets with shriveled apples, a jug of weak ale, a sack with just enough flour for one loaf. Transactions happen quickly, almost guiltily. No one wants to admit they're desperate, but everyone knows. A woman trades a length of rope for dried beans. A boy barters rabbit skins for a jug of barley ale. Even scraps have value, for they might keep your family alive one more night. But what if you had nothing left to trade? That is when begging began. You walk door to door, hat in hand, voice low with shame. You ask a neighbor for a heel of bread, a sip of broth, anything. Some turn you away, for their own shelves are nearly bare. Others share a little, even if it means less for their children. Hunger strips pride, but it also reveals kindness in unexpected corners. Historians still argue whether village life was harsher than often portrayed, a dog-eat-dog struggle, or whether bonds of kinship and obligation softened the edges of famine. Evidence from manorial rolls shows debts forgiven in famine years, neighbors standing surety for one another, or whole parishes pooling resources to buy imported grain. Survival was rarely a solo act. It was a net, frayed and uneven, but strong enough to catch many who would otherwise fall. And sometimes, in the bleakest winters, neighborly bonds turned creative. Families took turns cooking so no one's hearth went entirely cold. Children were sent to eat at different households on rotation, ensuring every child got at least one decent bowl of food a day. Communal hunts or shared foraging parties were organized, not just for food, but for companionship, so the bitter silence of famine wouldn't swallow the spirit as well as the body. Of course, jealousy and suspicion lurked too. A family who seemed to eat better than the rest might face whispers of hoarding, or worse, accusations of theft. But often, the balance of fear and empathy leaned toward cooperation. For you knew, and your neighbors knew, that when your turn came to beg, you would pray they remembered the time you gave away your last onion. Picture returning home with half a loaf tucked under your arm, gifted by the old widow at the edge of the village. It won't last long, but as you break it and share it with your family, you feel something stronger than hunger. It is the knowledge that survival is not just bread and broth. It is trust, woven between neighbors, fragile but vital. The bells toll again, not for a feast day this time, but for alms. You pull your cloak tight and shuffle toward the stone church, breath steaming in the air. Hunger presses, and the church offers one of the few reliable lifelines: charity. In the coldest winters, monasteries and parish kitchens became as vital as bread ovens, handing out bowls of pottage to the poorest, scraps of bread to the beggars, or a ladle of thin ale to warm the throat. You step into the shadow of the monastery gatehouse. The monks move in steady rhythm, ladling steaming broth from great iron pots into wooden bowls. The smell is plain: cabbage, onions, a hint of barley. But it is heavenly when your stomach aches. Children cluster at the front, their hands cupped, eyes wide as though they are about to taste a miracle. Behind them, widows and the crippled poor wait quietly. Even farmers who swore they would never beg find themselves here after their grain bins run dry. The church taught that feeding the hungry was a holy duty. To give bread was to earn favor in heaven. and so monasteries often set aside resources for this very purpose. They grew herbs and vegetables in cloister gardens, brewed their own ale, and kept fish ponds stocked for Lent. Even when famine raged, these kitchens tried to open their doors, though supplies ran thin. Historians still argue whether monasteries truly provided enough to make a difference, or whether their charity was more symbolic than substantial. Yet for many peasants, that steaming bowl was the line between life and death. It wasn't always simple kindness. Lords and priests also knew that a starving, desperate population could turn restless, even violent. By giving alms, they soothed both souls and tempers. Better to hand out a little food than face riots in the square. The act of charity thus carried both grace and strategy, a way to keep order as well as to fulfill holy law. Picture yourself receiving a crust of bread from a monk, his hand weathered from labor but steady, his voice murmuring a blessing. You tear it slowly, savoring each bite, even as your neighbor devours hers in 2 gulps. Around you, the line stretches on, faces pale, thin, some hardened, some grateful. The churchyard becomes a theater of survival, where hunger is briefly eased under the watchful eyes of saints carved in stone. And when you leave, bowl empty, cloak pulled tight again, you feel both humbled and strengthened. Humbled by need, strengthened by the knowledge that for at least one day the church has stood between you and the gnawing dark. These kitchens did not erase hunger, but they gave hope. And in the long freeze of a medieval winter, sometimes hope was the richest food of all. You sit close to the hearth, bowl in hand, while an elder leans in to tell a story. Food, in a medieval peasant's world, was never just food. It was tangled with beliefs, warnings, charms, and whispered superstitions that made sense of scarcity and explained why some things filled the belly while others were best avoided. There was the belief that certain foods carried warmth, not just in the fire, but in the body. Onions and garlic, strong-smelling and fiery on the tongue, were thought to drive out cold humors and evil spirits alike. Mothers pressed cloves of garlic into children's palms, insisting it would guard them through the winter nights. Salt was more than seasoning. It was protection, sprinkled at the doorway to keep misfortune out, or dissolved in broth as though it could shield the family from sickness. Other foods carried suspicion. Eating hare, some whispered, might make you cowardly. Fish eaten on the wrong day could spoil the soul, especially if it was not Friday or Lent. Some villagers swore that mushrooms carried curses, sprouting where devils had danced in the night. Historians still argue whether peasants truly avoided such foods, or whether these tales were more the creations of clerical writers eager to moralize, but the stories filtered into everyday choices all the same. Legends grew around miraculous foods. There were tales of loaves that never diminished, pots that refilled themselves overnight, saints who walked into starving villages and turned stones into bread. Children repeated these stories with awe, their imaginations stirred as much as their stomachs. Adults knew better, yet they told the tales anyway, for they gave comfort, the promise, however faint, that hunger might one day vanish with divine help. You picture yourself clutching a crust of rye bread, someone beside you muttering a charm before biting. Say a blessing, they warn, or the bread may turn to dust in your mouth. In a world where food was so scarce, it felt reckless not to take precautions. Better to whisper a prayer than risk angering forces unseen. Some taboos were practical in disguise. Meat left too long in smokehouses or milk turned sour might be called unlucky. when really it was unsafe to eat. Folk wisdom wrapped itself in superstition, keeping people cautious where science had no footing. And in this way, beliefs, strange, simple, or sacred, became another tool for survival. Legends didn't fill your belly, but they filled the long winter nights with meaning. Around the fire, with hunger always near, stories made thin meals richer, each bite flavored with a mixture of faith, fear, and hope. You wake one morning, and the air feels different. The frost still bites, but the sun lingers longer on the horizon, and somewhere beyond the village fields, you hear a bird's call that has been silent for months. Spring does not arrive all at once. It creeps, hesitant, cautious. But when you have survived winter on scraps and willpower, even the faintest change is enough to lift the heart. Your cellar is nearly bare. The last turnips are soft and wrinkled, the barley sack empty, the ale weak enough to be little more than flavored water. Yet hope grows in the thaw. Meltwater runs into ditches, and soon the earth softens under your boots. You kneel in the damp soil, planting beans, oats, barley, anything that might grow quickly. This is the peasant's promise. Endure the famine months until new green shoots break through. Historians still argue whether spring hunger, those leanest weeks of March and April, was worse than the deep freeze of January. Many accounts suggest it was. By then, stored food was gone, yet the fields had not yielded. But the difference was psychological. Now hunger was a tunnel with light at the end. You could picture leaves unfurling, lambs born in the pastures, fish stirring again in rivers no longer frozen. You imagine yourself tasting the first fresh greens, wild garlic shoots, nettles, tender herbs gathered at the edge of the woods. After months of stews made from dried scraps, the sharp, bright bite of green feels almost magical. Soon the hens begin laying again. Milk flows richer from cows grazing new grass, and the rhythm of plenty slowly returns. And though you still ache from the long hunger, you have learned something. Survival was not only about bread or broth. It was about patience, resilience, the kindness of neighbors, the faith that carried you through the silence of famine nights. Winter was a test. Spring is the reward. You sit at the edge of the field as the sun sets, watching the damp soil darken, knowing in weeks it will be alive with shoots. Hunger will return next winter, as sure as the cold. But tonight you let yourself believe in the slow promise of spring. Humans have always had families, even in caves, even with primitive tools, and even when the world was cruel and cold. They had children. And children, as always, were loud, messy, and extremely likely to get themselves into trouble. But how did early humans care for their little ones? How did they nurture them, protect them, and yes, occasionally spoil them rotten? You might be imagining a tender scene with a mother softly humming over a newborn by firelight. And that's not entirely wrong. There's evidence that infants were cherished. Bones show that some were carefully buried with flowers or special objects, suggesting that even then, humans recognized the fragility of new life. Parents probably spent a lot of time holding their babies. It's cold out there, and a tiny human is not exactly equipped to survive a frostbite winter on their own. So carrying them close would have been practical and comforting. Imagine little ones swaddled in animal skins, pressed against a parent's chest, smelling of smoke and fur, listening to the distant wind and the crackle of the fire. It's hard not to feel a certain warmth imagining that. And yes, of course, there was probably a fair bit of chaos. You can be loving and terrified at the same time. babies screamed, toddlers wandered off. Older children probably got into all sorts of mischief with sharp rocks, curious insects, and anything shiny. But in that mess, parents and siblings would have been constantly engaged. Life demanded attention, and in the midst of that, human bonds formed. Perhaps cavemen loved their children as much as we do, just with more dirt and fewer lullabies. Interestingly, there's evidence suggesting that some infants were carried for months on end. Not in strollers, obviously, and not with the sophisticated slings we might imagine, but tied in furs, tucked into folds of clothing, held with strong, patient arms. It was exhausting. And yet, humans persisted, because even in the harshest conditions, letting a child go unattended was a risk you simply didn't take. Survival and love were tangled together. Feeding children was another challenge. Nursing was essential, but in times when food was scarce, communities likely shared resources. Some anthropologists think that older siblings helped care for younger ones. And why not? If everyone survived a little better when the group worked together, that was an advantage. So perhaps the caveman family unit wasn't just nuclear. It was extended, cooperative, messy, and deeply human. Now, imagine a young father, not particularly strong, maybe a little awkward with a newborn, trying to keep the child warm while simultaneously roasting some mammoth meat. He fumbles, the baby squeals, a sibling giggles, and the fire blinks. That's domestic life in prehistory. Not glamorous, not Instagram ready, but profoundly, quietly, intensely loving. Playtime existed too. Children had to learn to navigate the world. They were taught, gently and firmly, the skills they'd need, recognizing edible plants, identifying dangerous animals, learning to mimic the movements of their elders. But also, they were allowed, encouraged perhaps, to explore, throw rocks, imitate bird calls, and run until their lungs burned. Play was a form of education, a way to bond and a way to test boundaries. And parents, tired as they were, watched closely. Some artifacts suggest that toys existed, or at least objects used in play. Small figurines, carved bones, little stones that could be thrown or balanced. Maybe some were meant for games of skill, perhaps others were comfort objects. One can imagine a small child clutching a smooth pebble, rocking it in their hands, listening to the rhythm of the wind, learning the patterns of life through repetition. The parents smiled quietly. They had their hands full, but they knew the importance of these small moments. Affection was likely expressed through touch, hugging, carrying, gentle slaps of encouragement. Parents and siblings leaned close to share warmth, comfort, and reassurance. Words may have been limited, but sounds, gestures, and looks carried meaning. A soft murmur, a protective arm, the subtle shift of a body to shield from wind or rain. These were the language of love. Some rituals surrounding children may have seemed odd or even morbid today. Some infants who died were buried with objects, as mentioned. Others may have been positioned in particular ways, placed with care under stones or in hollows. It wasn't superstition alone. It was an acknowledgement of life's fragility. Even death could be handled with respect, even love, and naturally, some practices didn't survive. Certain harsh survival tactics, leaving a child behind in emergencies, for instance, were probably common. Not out of cruelty, but necessity. Life was precarious. And yet, that doesn't erase the tenderness that existed in quieter, safer moments. The love was messy, practical, persistent, human. Older children likely took part in caregiving as well. The older sibling patrolling the edge of the camp or imitating parents by rocking a baby. or even just watching over toddlers as they toddled over uneven terrain. That too was part of growing up. Responsibility mingled with play. Mistakes happened, but they were forgiven because mistakes were inevitable. And in those mistakes, lessons were taught and love was communicated. Feeding was careful and deliberate. A little meat here, some berries there, perhaps gruel or crushed nuts for older children. And yes, sometimes older children might snatch food, sometimes infants were fussy, and sometimes the best laid plans failed. But effort counted as love. Every spoonful, every bite shared, every careful chew of soft meat was an act of nurturing. At night, the cave was quiet. The fire crackled. Parents laid their children near them, swaddled in furs, safe from wolves, cold, and wandering threats. Everyone exhaled, everyone listened. Infants may fuss, toddlers may whimper, older children settled near siblings, and all the while, the humans around them were alert, protective, patient. A very different kind of lullaby existed here. The murmurs of adults, the warmth of bodies, the soft rustle of furs. Simple, effective. Love. We can't know exactly what they thought. We can't hear their words, but we see traces in bones, in burial sites, in archaeological evidence of shared living spaces, in the care of infants and the division of labor. And what we see is unmistakable. Early humans cared, deeply, sometimes clumsily, sometimes harshly by necessity, but always, it seems, persistently, quietly, fundamentally. As children grew, so did the demands on adults. Life in small tribes wasn't just about survival. It was about coordination, observation, and occasionally tolerating the eccentricities of others. Some members of a tribe naturally took the lead. Some did not. And of course, some were simply impossible, because evolution seems to enjoy testing patience in subtle ways. Imagine a small band of humans, perhaps a dozen or so, moving carefully through a forested landscape or across open plains. One member, let's call him the planner, decides where the next hunting site should be. He is meticulous, stubborn, and convinced of his own genius. Naturally, he is always wrong, but the group humors him anyway, because social cohesion matters more than accuracy in the short term. Everyone knows that tomorrow they'll argue again, quietly, with smiles and nudges. Leadership in these early groups was rarely formal. There were no crowns, no chairs of authority. Influence depended on experience, charisma, strength, or sometimes sheer stubbornness. The oldest members carried wisdom about which berries were safe, which rivers flooded, which caves were structurally sound, yet wisdom didn't always translate to popularity. Younger members sometimes mocked them quietly while fetching water, and the elders grumbled, perfectly aware that their complaints were ignored. And yes, quarrels existed. Small disputes over meat portions, sleeping spots, or who got to sit closest to the fire. These were not dramatic fights, but quiet tensions, murmured disagreements, passive resistance. Imagine a small human glancing over, frowning ever so slightly as another reached for a particularly tasty morsel of roasted mammoth. The tension was subtle, intimate, and endlessly human. These interactions were the early prototypes of the petty rivalries and awkward social hierarchies that would one day plague royal courts long after the last cave was abandoned. Children, meanwhile, observed all of this. They absorbed the subtle cues of social life. Even toddlers, toddling unsteadily along a riverbank, noticed who spoke first, who got to decide, who was respected. And when they grew, they would replicate these dynamics in miniature, pushing for position, negotiating privileges, forming alliances over small stones or scraps of food. It is almost comforting to think that even then, Human beings were learning politics through trial, error, and occasional tantrums. The daily rhythm of life in a tribe was gentle, repetitive, and sometimes grating. Mornings were cold, nights were colder, food had to be found, water collected, fire tended. But there were moments of quiet, almost accidental beauty. A child laughing as a sibling tried to imitate a bird. An elder humming a low, vibrating tone while sharpening a stone tool. Smoke curling into the sky, carrying small scents of meat and earth. Life was hard, but it was textured. It had rhythms, small pleasures, and routine absurdities that made it memorable. And humans, even then, were remarkably creative. Someone carved a small figure from bone, perhaps to distract a child, perhaps to amuse themselves. Someone noticed that certain leaves made a better wrapping for food. Someone, likely tired and cranky, tried to invent a signal for danger that involved more than waving hands wildly. In all of these minor achievements, love and practicality intertwined. Every innovation, no matter how small, was both an expression of survival and often affection for those around them. Sleep, too, had its own subtleties. Even in caves, humans were never completely at rest. Someone always listened for the rustle of a predator, the faint sound of an approaching storm, or the quiet whimper of a baby. Parents took turns, sometimes without speaking. Older children may have slept near their siblings, bodies pressed close for warmth and reassurance. Every breath, every stir, every movement was quietly accounted for. And in that constant vigilance, there was care, there was protection, there was a love as enduring as the rocks that formed the walls of their shelters. Life in small groups also forced compromise. Resources were limited. Water holes could dry up. Hunting could fail. Illness and injury were ever-present threats. In this environment, patience was learned out of necessity. Babies waited. Toddlers adapted. Elders tolerated mistakes. And everyone, in some small, persistent way, participated in ensuring the survival of the youngest and most vulnerable. Love, in this context, was pragmatic. It was measured in the sharing of meat, the warmth of furs, the careful placement of a hand over a child's chest during the coldest nights. Some families likely lost children, despite their best efforts. It was inevitable. And yet, this did not diminish the bonds. Those who survived were cared for with renewed attention. Parents and siblings adapted. The rhythms of affection, discipline, and instruction continued, subtly, almost invisibly. In this way, even the cruel realities of prehistoric life could coexist with tenderness, affection, and devotion. And yet, there was always room for eccentricity. One adult might have a peculiar obsession with a type of berry, insisting on carrying it long distances, despite the group's gentle protests. Another might have a minor fear of snakes that led to elaborate avoidance rituals, quietly observed by the children, who learned both humor and caution simultaneously. And children themselves developed quirks, preferences for certain stones, repeated games with shadows, the occasional tantrum that forced patience and ingenuity from adults. All of these little habits were folded into daily life, becoming, over time, the early social culture of humans. The interplay of affection and hierarchy was constant. A strong, patient adult might carry a child across a river, silently demonstrating courage, care, and attention to detail. A playful sibling might toss a small pebble into the river, testing both balance and reaction. A stubborn adolescent might insist on leading the group along a shortcut, earning minor reprimands and hidden amusement. Every interaction was a learning opportunity, and every learning opportunity reinforced the bonds that allowed the group to persist through hardship. Meals were social events. Even in scarcity, there were rules. Who ate first, who shared with whom, and how leftovers were distributed. Children observed and learned negotiation and fairness, sometimes mimicking adults' petty compromises, sometimes outright challenging them. In these small moments, lessons in empathy and cooperation were quietly absorbed. And every successful negotiation, every careful offering, every small act of generosity reinforced the invisible threads of affection that bound the group together. Even illness was communal. If a child fell sick, the entire group adjusted. Food might be carried, work deferred, or positions shifted to accommodate care. There was no formal hospital, no doctor's orders, just the quiet, relentless attention of those who cared. And in this attention, the depth of love was revealed. It was measured not in words, but in actions, repeated over and over, day after day. Night fell, inevitably. The fire's glow softened. Shadows flickered across walls and faces. Children were tucked near adults, swaddled or pressed into furs. Elders murmured gentle warnings or soft, low-toned songs. Sometimes the wind outside carried the faint cry of a distant predator, or the rustle of falling leaves, or the eerie sigh of a river. And yet, within the circle of warmth, protection, and shared attention, there was calm. There was safety. There was human love, simple, quiet, enduring. And so, life continued, gently, insistently, with a rhythm of care, play, learning, and survival. Humans, even then, were teaching, protecting, and loving their children. And even in the harshest conditions, even in the smallest, most fragile groups, these bonds persisted. They were the foundation of human society, the beginning of civilization, the first tender echoes of the devotion that would later be recorded in stories, books, and histories. In observing them, we glimpse both ourselves and our ancestors, flawed, human, inventive, stubborn, and profoundly capable of love. It was not perfect. It was not clean. It was often exhausting. But it was real, deeply, quietly real, and it persisted. And that persistence, perhaps, is one of the most comforting thoughts to carry into sleep. The heart of a Stone Age camp was its fire. Imagine the flicker of orange light bouncing off cave walls or casting a glow on the faces of those huddled close. Fire was life. It kept predators at bay, warmed frozen fingers, and cooked meat to make it safer and easier to eat. But fire was not guaranteed. Matches and lighters didn't exist, so losing a flame could be a disaster. Many groups guarded embers carefully, covering them with ash to keep them smoldering overnight. At dawn, someone, often an older member too frail to join the hunt, would stir those coals back to life. If the camp ever let fire die, it might mean days of painstaking work to spark a new one with stone and wood. Children grew up knowing that fire wasn't just heat and light. It was survival itself. The nightly gathering around the flames wasn't only for warmth, but also for storytelling. Around those fires, knowledge passed down. How to track animals, where to find water, how to chip flint into blades. Fire was the classroom of prehistory, the place where culture itself was born. Life for children in the Stone Age was no game of dolls or toy cars, but it wasn't all misery either. Their play was practice for survival. Imagine a group of youngsters chasing each other through the grass, sticks in hand, pretending to hunt rabbits. Those sticks were the first lessons in spear throwing. Girls and boys alike learned by copying adults. A child might follow their mother to dig for roots, watching how she recognized the difference between a tasty tuber and a poisonous one. Others would trail behind the hunters, carrying small stones and imitating the movements of their fathers or uncles. They also had chores. Kids helped gather firewood, carried water in hollowed gourds, and fetched stones for tool making. In many groups, they were responsible for guarding the fire when adults were away. An enormous responsibility for tiny hands. But childhood wasn't only work. There were games of wrestling, racing, and simple contests of balance or climbing. These games weren't fun for fun's sake. They trained muscles, instincts, and social bonds. Every scraped knee was preparation for adulthood, and in those hours of laughter and squabbles, humanity's first friendships and rivalries were born. For Stone Age adults, hunting wasn't a thrilling sport. It was a brutal necessity. Imagine rising at dawn, gripping a wooden spear tipped with sharpened flint, and knowing that today's success or failure could mean the difference between feasting and hunger. Small game, hares, birds, fish, were common targets, and children or weaker hunters often joined these easier pursuits. But the real danger came with larger prey. Groups worked together, coordinating to corner a wild horse, a bison, or, if fortune favored them, a mammoth. The air filled with shouts, pounding feet, and the thud of spears striking flesh. Hunting was never certain. A missed throw, a slip in the mud, or a charging animal could spell disaster. Many skeletons from the period show broken bones that healed badly, evidence of hunts gone wrong. Yet when the kill succeeded, it meant abundance. Meat for eating, hides for warmth, bones for tools, tendons for string. Nothing went to waste. Hunts also bound the group together. Success meant shared meals around the fire, pride for the hunters, and security for the children and elders. Failure meant rumbling stomachs and anxious nights. Every hunt was a gamble with survival itself. For all the drama of the hunt, it was gathering that quietly kept people alive most days. Women, children, and elders usually handled this work, roaming the landscape with baskets, digging sticks, and sharp eyes. They searched for roots buried in the soil, berries hidden in thickets, nuts hanging in trees, and edible greens by streams. A sharp nose helped too. Fermenting fruit was often the sign of a feast waiting to be plucked. Some plants were useful, some poisonous, and knowing the difference was a matter of life and death. Anthropologists tell us that in many hunter-gatherer societies, plants made up the bulk of the calories people ate, sometimes as much as 70 to 80%. So while the men might return dramatically with a hunk of meat every few days, it was the gatherers who ensured there was something to chew every day in between. Children learned by shadowing their mothers and grandmothers. A curious toddler might try to stick a strange leaf in their mouth, only to be gently corrected or sternly yanked back, depending on the plant. Over time, knowledge passed down. Which nuts to crack, which roots to roast, which berries to avoid unless you wanted a long, painful night. Gathering wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable. And in the grand tally of Stone Age survival, reliability mattered more than heroics. As the sun slipped low, the real center of Stone Age life flickered to life: the fire. It was more than warmth. It was protection, community, and something close to magic. People circled close, skins pulled around their shoulders, faces glowing orange in the shifting light. Smoke curled upward, stinging the eyes but keeping insects at bay. The fire kept predators nervous, drove off the damp, and softened tough food into something edible. Evening hours around the flames were for mending tools, cracking bones for marrow, and sharing the day's gossip. Yes, even then. A hunter exaggerated the size of the boar he chased, A grandmother told the children how the stars came to be. Someone teased another for tripping in the river. Laughter mingled with the crackle of wood. Fire was also where knowledge passed on. Myths, warnings, stories of ancestors. They were repeated until even the youngest could chant them by heart. And for a brief stretch of time, with bellies full and danger held at the dark's edge, people felt safe. Of course, safety was temporary. Embers needed constant tending. One careless moment, and the group could wake to cold ashes and a desperate scramble for sparks. But for as long as it burned, the fire was the heartbeat of the camp. Stone Age children didn't have wooden toy chests or brightly painted blocks, but they still found ways to play. Play was practice, disguised as fun. A child might chase another with a stick, pretending it was a spear. They might skip stones across a stream, or throw pebbles at a tree trunk to see who had the best aim. These games honed the reflexes they would one day need to hunt or defend. Little ones also imitated the work of adults. Tiny hands carried twigs as if gathering wood, or dragged a bone across the dirt in mock butchery. If someone caught a beetle, it could become a temporary pet, inspected, teased, and eventually forgotten. Some evidence even hints at music and dancing. Flutes carved from bird bones and percussion-like marks on stone suggest that rhythm and song were part of play as much as of ritual. Children probably learned to clap, stamp, and hum long before they could hunt or weave. Play wasn't a luxury. It taught coordination, social bonds, and resilience. It was a rehearsal for survival, and perhaps one of the only moments of pure joy in a life otherwise shaped by constant uncertainty. Stone Age children didn't have wooden toy chests or brightly painted blocks, but they still found ways to play. Play was practice, disguised as fun. A child might chase another with a stick, pretending it was a spear. They might skip stones across a stream, or throw pebbles at a tree trunk to see who had the best aim. These games honed the reflexes they would one day need to hunt or defend. Little ones also imitated the work of adults. Tiny hands carried twigs as if gathering wood, or dragged a bone across the dirt in mock butchery. If someone caught a beetle, it could become a temporary pet, inspected, teased, and eventually forgotten. Some evidence even hints at music and dancing. Flutes carved from bird bones and percussion-like marks on stone suggest that rhythm and song were part of play as much as of ritual. Children probably learned to clap, stamp, and hum long before they could hunt or weave. Play wasn't a luxury. It taught coordination, social bonds, and resilience. It was a rehearsal for survival, and perhaps one of the only moments of pure joy in a life otherwise shaped by constant uncertainty. Romance, in the modern sense, didn't exist. There were no flowers, no candlelit dinners, and certainly no love letters sealed with wax. But attraction, pair bonding, and jealousy, those are as old as humanity itself. Archaeologists can't tell us who fancied whom, but patterns suggest small groups needed flexible arrangements. Sometimes couples paired for life. Sometimes partnerships shifted. A man might drift between camps, or a woman might choose a new mate if her partner failed to provide. Pragmatism often ruled over passion. Still, affection left its mark. Skeletal studies show healed injuries, suggesting partners or families cared for the weak when they might otherwise have been abandoned. Grave goods placed with the dead hint at bonds that extended beyond survival. And cave art, those handprints and figures drawn side by side, carry the faint whisper of connection. Jealousy and rivalry likely brewed as well. A successful hunter or skilled gatherer would have been more attractive, leading to tension. A fight over status or mates could be settled with fists, sticks, or a quiet grudge carried until an opportunity arose. And then there were children, the inevitable result of all this pairing. Love may not have looked like ours, but bonds of care existed. Partners might quarrel, switch, or vanish, but the survival of the young remained at the center of Stone Age relationships. Life wasn't just hunting, gathering, and staying alive. People also reached for something beyond survival, something that looked suspiciously like culture. Take cave art. Deep inside limestone caverns, figures of bison, horses, and mammoths line the walls. Red ochre, black charcoal, and yellow minerals turned bare rock into living scenes. Why? Perhaps to tell stories, to mark territory, or simply to marvel at the beauty of a hunt frozen in paint. And then there were rituals. Small carvings of animals or human forms suggest people carried symbols. Beads made from shells or teeth were strung into necklaces. Graves sometimes contained tools or ornaments, as if the dead needed company in the afterlife, or at least deserved a proper send-off. These acts weren't practical in the strictest sense. You couldn't eat a painted bison. You couldn't clothe yourself in a carved figurine. Yet they mattered. They gave shape to identity, memory, and mystery. Sitting by the fire, people might have told myths about spirits in the woods or ancestors watching from the stars. A flickering shadow on a cave wall could become a story. A strange dream could be retold as a vision. Meaning wove itself into daily life, transforming survival into something richer. For all the warmth of fireside stories and shared hunts, Stone Age life wasn't free from tension. Living close, relying on each other for survival, meant quarrels were inevitable. Sometimes it was small, who got the biggest cut of meat, or who shirked their turn to gather wood. Other times, disputes grew sharper, over mates, over status, over who led the hunt. Archaeological evidence shows cracked skulls, broken arms, and spear points lodged in bones, reminders that disagreements could spill into violence. Conflict didn't just happen within groups. Camps competed for the same resources. A stream rich in fish, a grove heavy with nuts, or a cave offering shelter. These were worth fighting for. Encounters between different bands could range from cautious trade to brutal ambush. The line was thin and trust rare. Yet violence was balanced by cooperation. Without some level of peace, groups wouldn't survive the winter. The ability to patch quarrels, share resources, and form alliances mattered as much as the ability to fight. The earliest communities lived always on that uneasy edge, needing each other, but also resenting each other. In a world with no laws, no police, and no courts, justice was immediate. A wrong could be repaid with exile, retaliation, or a quiet grudge that lasted until an opportunity arose. Community kept you alive, but it also kept you under constant watch. If there was one constant in Stone Age life, it was the weather. The sun dictated movement, the rain tested patience, and the cold, well, the cold could kill. Summer meant abundance. Rivers teemed with fish, plants ripened, and animals grew fat. Camps were lively then, with food easier to find and nights warm enough to sleep under the open sky. Children played longer, and hunters ranged farther without fear of freezing. But autumn brought preparation. People gathered nuts, dried meat, and stretched hides into makeshift coverings. Fires burned longer, and the thought of the lean months ahead weighed heavily. Winter was always the test. Bitter winds crept into caves, snow sealed off paths, and food grew scarce. A missed hunt or a spoiled cache could mean disaster. Even spring, which we like to imagine as hopeful, brought its own dangers. Meltwater flooded streams, animals were lean from surviving the cold, and people, already weakened, faced hunger just when they needed strength. Every season demanded adaptation. There were no cozy cabins, no weather reports, and certainly no guarantees. People rose and slept with the rhythm of the elements. To live was to adjust endlessly to whatever the sky decided. When darkness swallowed the camp, life shifted into something quieter, slower, and more uncertain. Sleep was never guaranteed. Most people likely slept in cycles, dozing for a few hours, waking to tend the fire, then drifting off again. The crackle of flames, the snoring of companions, the distant howl of wolves. These were the lullabies of the Stone Age. Babies fussed, dogs barked, and someone always kept half an ear open for danger. Dreams carried their own weight. Without science to explain them, they became messages, warnings, or whispers from ancestors. A strange vision might inspire a story told the next evening by the fire. A nightmare might be treated as an omen, leaving the dreamer uneasy for days. Night also brought stars. Imagine lying on a bed of hides, smoke curling from the fire, and looking upward at a sky untouched by modern light. The constellations would have been dazzling, bright enough to guide, strange enough to spark myths. So sleep wasn't just rest. It was fractured, noisy, sometimes interrupted by fear, sometimes softened by wonder. It carried both the weariness of survival and the mystery of the unseen. As the last embers dimmed, a Stone Age day folded quietly into the next. Nothing was ever certain, but the rhythm repeated itself with a strange steadiness. Morning brought movement. Hunters slipping into the woods, gatherers roaming the hills, children trailing along. Midday meant chewing on whatever could be found, sometimes in laughter, sometimes in silence. By evening, the campfire drew everyone back together, smoke rising, stories circling, and tired bodies warming in the glow. Survival shaped every moment. The hunt, the gathering, the mending, the nursing of the sick, even the laughter of children. It all fed into the same unending cycle of keeping the group alive just a little longer. Yet within that grind were flickers of humanity. Painted bison on cave walls, beads strung from shells, the soft rhythm of a bone flute echoing in the night. So what did cavemen actually do all day? They lived. They worked, worried, played, loved, fought, healed, dreamed, and endured. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for everything that came after. By the time sleep finally claimed them, curled close to the fire, the day's uncertainties drifted away, at least until the sun rose again and the cycle began anew. And now we've come to the end of our wandering through a day in the Stone Age. From the crack of dawn to the flicker of the evening fire, we've traced the rhythm of lives that were simple, fragile, and yet strangely familiar. They woke to hunger, to tasks that never truly ended, and to dangers that lurked in the shadows. They gathered berries, hunted with hope more than certainty, and warmed themselves against a cold that never really went away. Yet within all of that survival, they found moments for laughter, for games, for quiet affection. They made art, they told stories, they dreamed. They lived in a way that was harsh, but not empty. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? To know that across thousands of years, people have carried the same mixture of worries and joys. They cared for their children. They squabbled with neighbors. They looked at the stars and wondered. So much has changed, but that part hasn't. So as you lie here now, with the steady weight of blankets, the hum of modern life somewhere in the background, Perhaps let yourself feel connected to that long chain of humanity. Imagine the glow of the fire, the low murmur of voices, the safety of a group resting close together. The dangers are gone, the hunger is sated, but the quiet at the end of the day is the same. Let that thought settle over you like a soft hide drawn across the shoulders. Let the rhythm of their lives dissolve into the rhythm of your breathing. The day has ended for them, as it has for you. And now, nothing remains but rest. Sleep well.